There is a true race going on when it comes to satellites, particularly with low orbit. Thousands of satellites being put out in a very short time frame, and none of the big countries wants to be a loser in this. And even Europe now has created this IRIS program because we need our own capacities. Right now we depend on SpaceX to put the satellites up into space, which is, of course, not quite independent. We are not as independent as you would need to be.
Hey, SpaceWatchers, this is Space Café Radio, your channel about trends, awesome events, and interesting people in the space sector. I am your host, Thorsten Krinning, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global. And today, I'm joined for a fascinating conversation with Dr. Gérar, a member of the Luxembourg Parliament and head of the European Interparliamentary Space Conference delegation. In our episode, we dive into the dynamics of the global space race, Europe's initiatives in space legislation, and the role of the universities in advancing space technologies. Dr. Schockmel also shares insights on the awarding of innovative projects focused on sustainability, discusses the potential evolution of ICE into a more formal body, and looks ahead future challenges and opportunities in the European space sector. Buckle up, it will be a wild ride. Enjoy the episode. I'm honored to speak with Dr. Gérar Schockmel. Welcome to our Space Café Radio. Gérar, how are you doing?
Welcome, Thorsten. Well, I'm very happy to have this conversation with you.
We do not hear very often about the European Interparliamentary Space Conference, so could you give us a general introduction to it?
Yes, actually, the European Interparliamentary Space Conference was founded 25 years ago. That was in 1999. And it was founded by the space groups of 4 nations, which are Germany, UK, France, and Italy. The idea of ICE is to create a tool for interparliamentary cooperation, bringing together national parliamentary representatives with a particular interest in space affairs. Actually, ICE is an informal forum and does not constitute a legal entity. ICE, however, is governed by a charter, and the charter, of course, defines how we function. Normally, there is a rotating annual presidency. The presidency starts on 1st of January and ends on 31st of December of the same year. So that's the annual rotating presidency. And during the year, there are 2 events that are organized. A workshop, that's number 1. And then later in the year, a plenary session with the General Assembly. We also, on that occasion, draft a resolution, which is a non-binding resolution, but which defines clearly where we see room for improvement when it comes to space affairs. And the Secretariat, since 2009, has been supported by the European Space Policy Institute. Actually, a nation can become full member if the nation is either a member of the EU or member of ESA, and in addition has created a parliamentary body dealing with space affairs. Then you are eligible for full membership. There's also the possibility of an associate membership for nations that are not members of the EU nor of the ESA, or observers. So these are different statutes, but that's how it works. Yes.
Great, Gerard. Thank you very much for this introduction of ICE. So reflecting on your tenure as a president of ICE, what were the main themes you choose to focus on, and why did you feel they were particularly important for the sector?
As I said, that with the annual presidency, there are 2 events during the year. The first event was a workshop, and we organized that workshop in March. And the topic of the workshop was space legislation, legislating space, because obviously we don't want space to go into the Wild West. And the way we had our discussion structured was, first we were talking about the international framework, legal framework. And there, of course, you have the 5 UN treaties. And in addition, you have the Artemis Accords initiated by the US, but there are, I think, 48 signature states. So these are truly international treaties, and you have states on all 5 continents that participate. Then we went on to discuss the regional legislation, and here that was obviously the US. The US tended to be rather an ad hoc legislation left to different government bodies, which actually doesn't exactly make things very easy because there are different federal agencies involved, and is a system that grew over time, but it is not really integrated. Then you have the Chinese system, which used to be very highly centralized, but now there has been partial privatization and partial opening to private enterprises because there's quite a race going on and private initiatives then are part of the game. And then, of course, the EU framework. When it comes to the EU, on the one hand, we have the EU itself, we have the Commission, and on the other hand, we have European Space Agency. You have the 27 member states of the EU, you have 22 member states of ESA. ESA has been the major player so far, and since we were discussing legislation, when legislation is about security, then obviously it's EU regulation. When legislation is more concerning private activities, then it's both. It's EU legal framework and it's also an ESA legal framework. So there are the two. Another thing about Europe that can be said is that how does it function? Because Europe has 27 nations, we haven't got a central single licensing authorities, which could be criticized. But on the other hand, Europe has a set of mandatory measures for national licensing authorities, and those need to be respected. So there is a harmonization here, although that is left to member states. But then when it comes to technical requirements, there too is a harmonization defined by the EU of what member states need to respect. That was the regional part. And then we went on to discuss national space legislation. Of course, Luxembourg has been one of the early movers when it comes to space and space resources. You know that because you have been here. But of course, there are other countries who have quite interesting legislation. And so there was a very lively exchange on that. So that was the workshop we held in March. And then we moved on, as is generally planned, to September. And here we had our plenary session and we also had our General Assembly. Here the topic was a different one because in March it was legislating space. However, the topic in September for our roundtable discussions were universities. For us, universities are keys because universities are in charge of education, of training. They carry out research collaborations. They provide innovation. They are linked, obviously, between themselves. There are public-private partnerships between the university and companies, basically. And so the universities was really the topic we chose for the roundtable discussions in September. And there actually we had 3 rounds of discussion. The first round of discussion was about the science behind space. Because when it comes to science, it is all very technological and there are very specific requirements if you want to operate activities in space. And it is at universities that this knowledge is to a large extent being elaborated. Then the second roundtable discussion was on frameworks for increased public value. Actually, nowadays, universities have the mandate also to contribute to the public interest and be in constant dialogue with the public about its own activities and, of course, to contribute in terms of its expertise when it comes to a public debate. So that was number 2. And then number 3, it clearly was building the workforce of tomorrow. Because if you know that activity has been exploding recently, and of course we need professionals who really work in space, who are educated to work in space. So that was number 3 of the discussions. Then, of course, we had our General Assembly. There were certain topics here. First of all, we were very pleased to admit a new member. The new member is Finland. Finland has now joined the European Interparliamentary Space Conference. Then, of course, we had to see who will assume the next presidency. The next presidency starts on January 1st and that will last till December 31st. So that's Estonia. So that has been settled. Then there was, I think we will discuss that, a very pleasant occasion also because there were the awards. There are joint awards by ESA and by ISC, and we will discuss that later. And of course, we defined a resolution, our ISC resolution for this year. Since basically there are different sections of our resolution. The first section is research and education. That, of course, has again much to do with universities and academia, funding science programs to facilitate the use of space data. Also, space education, exchange programs between universities, between research institutions, accessibility of research papers to researchers, but also to the general public. Sometimes if you have a research paper, you can put it in a more simple format, wrap the messages in a way such as to have it understood by the general public. Space education in national education programs, because before you go to university, you are perhaps 12 years at school, and here too, space can become a topic. Then, of course, the media. There must be communication with the media, because it's not a main topic right now, generally speaking, for the media and for the press and the public sector, which I already mentioned. So that is research and education. That is section number 1 of our resolution. Section number 2 is workforce development. Again, that was also part of the roundtable discussion, so one goes with the other, obviously. There is a certain skills gap in the European space workforce. There must be educational programs, there must be funding, there must be mentorship, particularly to have students and young professionals choose a certain career that leads onto activities in the space sector. Once they have been educated, there must be opportunities in terms of jobs available. And for those who have carried out research and then perhaps want to create a startup company, there must be frameworks that encourage such entrepreneurship. So that was section 2. Section 3 is community building, which ties a little bit into everything, but there are also women in aerospace, there's the young space professionals, and of course there must be education contributions to all kinds of agencies and institutions. And then the final section is recognition of excellence. And here we have obviously the joint ISC and ESA Space for Sustainability Award. It says sustainability because that's exactly what we would like to achieve, and which I think remains a constant challenge, because it's not enough to send satellites into space. They have a limited time span. And afterwards, what will happen if they go into atmosphere? Then they will burn, or you can move them into outer space, depending on which orbit, obviously, they have been. It's getting crowded up there, since there have been so many satellites now put out into low orbits, particularly with Starlink and SpaceX. And as Europe also wants to catch up on that with the IRIS-2 program, which is specifically on satellites, and developing our present satellites, particularly also the middle orbit. So the idea is all that should be sustainable in the long run. I think that there is a need for legislation, because if you have legislation, the rules are clear, and that helps anyone who's active in space. Then there might be actors who are less interested in legislation. I won't call them by their names. And yet that can cause problems, because there's traffic management, very simply, in terms of satellites moving all around planet Earth. This needs collaboration. It needs cooperation. There's security issue related to debris. There's liability. Basically, when it comes to liability, you can always say it's the licensing authority, and then it's the launching state, who are clearly liable in terms of international law for activities that result from their space presence. I think these are very important points.
It's wonderful and well-rounded. I was about to ask more questions about universities and space, but you already answered them in your talk. But there's one question about the universities, and before I'm coming to the Sustainability Award. So how do you see the role of universities evolving in the space sector, and what potential do they have to address the current challenges in European space policy?
Yes, basically, I think that look at engineering, for example. You need engineering for space activities, for satellites, for satellite communication. I think it is important for those who have chosen activities in sectors, who have chosen education, that they know that space is just one option, a very attractive option, because it may not actually be on people's personal radar. And I think it is here that frameworks, that publicity publicity to some extent, that presence in the media, awareness within educational institutions and, of course, universities will benefit from being increased.
I see. Let's move on to the ESA Sustainability Award that you mentioned earlier. How was this year's competition received, and could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes, actually, I think that 2 projects were rewarded. And that is very attractive to those who are the winners of these awards, because since it is a joint ESA and ISC award, they are in contact with ESA. And since they are proposing solutions when it comes to sustainable development in space, the idea is that there is also a practical application. And so obviously ESA is very well placed to put them in touch with those who might be interested in such projects. The first one is quite exciting, actually, and it's about titanium. You know that titanium is an essential metal for all of ESA's most ambitious space missions, because as a physician, we implant titanium prosthesis in terms of a hip prosthesis or in terms of a knee prosthesis. We know what a good material it is. But when it comes to space, the properties that are particularly attractive are, of course, that titanium is low density, has an excellent chemical resistance and an excellent high strength. However, the way titanium is produced for industry in general and for space industry in particular is problematic, because right now the industrial process, which is the coal process being used, actually is very harmful to the environment. Just to explain this, first of all, you need elevated temperatures for that process, but then you create lots of CO2. For extraction of a single kilogram of titanium, you will produce as much as 35 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. That means that you will produce 15 times more CO2 than what you would produce for producing a kilogram of steel. And you know that steel is really one of the main producers, the production of steel. And here we are 15 times that if you compare kilogram to kilogram. So that's a big problem. You also inject a very hazardous gas, which is the chlorine gas, which then will be processed to toxic intermediates that are also corrosive. So, for example, you would not want to use on a spaceship, for example. The result then will be acidic waste. And where will the acidic waste go? Very simply, very often it is just injected into deep wells in rivers and seawater. So sooner or later it will end up in groundwater and our drinking water. And so it is a big polluter when it comes to the ground, when it comes to water, even when it comes to air, because of this gas, which is a toxic gas, which is chlorine gas. And here, Mr. Alexander Rützler has a very interesting proposal. But just to continue still with the titanium story, there's another thing. Europe is not really a titanium producer. We get almost all of our titanium from Russia. Now, when you know that, I'm not talking about conditions titanium being produced in Russia, but already conditions of them being produced elsewhere follow the same process, this Kroll process. But Europe also needs titanium for fighter jets, for missiles, for submarines, and we are dependent on Russia. So that is not a very healthy situation. Titanium traffic is not subject to EU sanctions, but that doesn't really solve the problem of dependence. And here comes now a very interesting proposal, which is actually a combined proposal, and it's to extract titanium from titanium oxides. And the idea is you have a titanium oxide and you apply an electrolysis to it, molten salt electrolysis, and yet you get titanium, obviously, and you get oxygen. So that is quite interesting because the byproduct is oxygen and not CO2. And the oxygen, actually, you can use on a spaceship. For example, if you have a lunar mission, you have heaps of titanium oxides in lunar regolith. Now, lunar regolith is basically the layer of rock covering the entire lunar surface. So there's a total abundance of that. And according to simple calculations, the astronauts could actually extract from this rock, from this regolith, the O2, the oxygen that they need for daily consumption. So they would be autonomous as regards to that, because importing oxygen from Earth is quite an important undertaking. So that's a byproduct. Now, in terms of process, because we said that the Kroll process, which is a normal industrial process, is highly harmful to the environment. In this case, for this electrolysis, you can fare with much lower temperatures, and you don't have to inject this toxic gas, you don't have this intermediate toxic waste. This is actually quite an environmentally friendly way. It is based on a combination of technologies, but none of those technologies is actually new. So they are being used daily on a routine basis on other applications. But this specific application generally should have good chances of working. It's a new avenue to exploit. It is still at the proof of concept stage. But as I said, there is really no fundamentally new procedure or technology involved. All of them have made their proofs in other domains. So I think this is actually a very good proposal that could not only be used when in space or on the lunar mission extracting titanium and oxygen from lunar regolith, but of course it could also serve for titanium extractions here on Earth, which might be in a second phase because the need for oxygen is not there in terms of motive. And titanium, it would be more environmentally friendly and change procedure, which may not be happening overnight. But that, of course, with the best case scenario, it not being limited to applications in space, as I said, in situ, on the moon, but it also finding its way into routine industrial practice. I loved it when I was reading this. But as I said, why is it eco-friendly? Because the process is free from toxic chemicals and free from hazardous wastewater. And there's no CO2 production because with the electrolysis, I mean, there might be some indirect CO2 production, but the electrolysis produces oxygen, which is fine, which is just fine.
What do you believe makes this award important for advancing sustainability space practices, and how can young innovators contribute to that? What you said, I think it's very important. There's a technology that is seen to be used on the moon surface, but we are not there yet. That's 5 years from now, 10 years from now. But we have today a situation on Earth where we produce titanium, as you mentioned before, in this process that is established, and we might look into more environmental friendly processes here. So to have this use case for Earth as well, I think it's very important.
That is the normal fate of research. First, you have an idea, then you do some experiments, then you do a proof of concept, then you scale up. As soon as you go into industrial production, there's always a scale up. And when you scale up, of course, you need to modify your technologies because there's another dimension now that needs to be constructed. I personally was in pharmaceutical industry, so I know about scaling up, which sometimes changes the process and changes the materials that you are using. But I think that is normal business. Research is not transformed into everyday business practice overnight. But I think what is important is that ESA has committed to the fullest to the Paris Agreement and to the European Green Deal and the Sustainability Development Goals. This is not an empty letter, so to speak, and therefore there is this award to really help innovative solutions being developed further, being developed into practical application, and for those who are doing this to be connected to the industry, to stakeholders, to actors in space affairs. The second one can actually probably be explained more readily. That's Fiona Poda, who won this award. And actually, what it is about animal migration and urbanization patterns. Because you know that the humankind is spreading all over the planet. We are really moving into wildlife. What can animals do? They can run away, but sometimes big animals will run away. Small animals might perhaps not run away and just run into little villages or towns popping up. And then, for example, there can be a risk of infectious disease because then all of a sudden you have an exposure of humans to microorganisms, to bacteria, to viruses that come from wildlife. And so the question is how that can be monitored. But it must be said that animal migration is, of course, a critical process because it ensures the survival and reproductive success of many species. They need to be able to migrate already in terms of being able to find their food. On the other hand, there can be no doubt that climate change significantly affects animal migration patterns as well as human activities and especially urbanization, of course, which worsens the challenges for animals who need to be able to migrate. So now the idea of this project, which claims that over half of the world's biodiversity relies on the ability to move freely, and many of these migration paths being blocked because of of urbanization and natural habitats becoming inhabitable actually for certain animal species. So the solution that is being proposed is an integration. So you have both satellite data, you collect those data from satellites, you have ground-based data, you have measuring stations that are somewhere on the ground, and you have AI. So the idea is that you have some kind of deep learning algorithm to integrate all those informations, and you will watch both. You will watch animal migration and you will watch urbanization patterns, because obviously they are tightly linked. And that is actually the idea. In terms of the algorithms that can be developed, satellite data we have already, ground-based data, this is also technically no problem to have them. And so this is actually what is being proposed as a solution, that migration, urbanization patterns be followed very closely for us to react, to see when problems occur, perhaps even to predict with some distance before they occur. And that is what the second award is about.
Very interesting development. And I'm saying that as someone who has raccoons in his garden and we see them every night. Yeah, maybe we can contribute to this study with our first-hand experience and not just using satellite, just our wildlife cameras. Let's move on and talk about the ESA Parliamentary Assembly initiative that you introduced this idea as a potential future direction for ICE. Can you share some of the motivation behind this initiative and some of the discussion surrounding it?
Yes, indeed. The basic idea is that we want ISC to develop. Then the question is how we can have ISC develop. Because where is the place for ISC? Because normally you have already national parliaments and they may have commissions dedicated to space, which actually one of the preconditions for a nation to become a full member of ISC. So I think that is already working. But what I was thinking is that it might be useful to strengthen our relationship with ESA. And one way to do that, of course, would be for ISC to evolve into an ESA Parliamentary Assembly. That would be the idea if one were pushing this idea. This would allow to increase ESA's interparliamentary dimension, to bestow a certain legitimacy onto ESA's decision-making process, having in addition this parliamentary assembly, providing an interparliamentary network to ESA and making ESA benefit from direct member states' legislative oversight. So that's the ESA part. But there's another part, because if we were to evolve into an ESA Parliamentary Assembly, we would also establish formal relations between ESA and the European Parliament, because we are parliamentarians. Obviously, ISC is composed out of parliamentarians. And obviously, then that would establish a relationship between ESA and the European Parliament, which is attractive. I personally also think that if we strengthen our activities, even our national stakeholders could benefit in terms of our national space agencies, in terms of our universities, our research, space research, our businesses. But that's my personal. I must say that this was my initiative. This is all at a very preliminary stage. ESA has not been consulted because I thought we would first have a preliminary debate among ourselves. There's always a risk that things will move very slowly because of the system with the yearly presidency and with the fact that we only are having 2 events a year. One for the workshops, which is generally in spring, and then in autumn, the General Assembly and the working groups. So that was my idea. Actually, I also think that obviously another key actor is ASPI. As I said, our secretariat is since 2009 is permanently assumed by ASPI. So that's one part of that. Also, considering the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think to strengthen cooperation can only be in everybody's best interest. Then, of course, not everybody might like it, because as I explained at the very beginning, is that ISC is a very informal organization. We are not a legal entity right now. So we are, if you so wish, a free electron spinning at our own speed, deciding ourselves what we are going to do, not going to do. There is little pressure here. Some members might see a problem with us evolving into an ESA parliamentary assembly, because then we will lose some of our freedom. We will need to professionalize. So we would need our own secretariats. We would need the funding, which actually now we don't need funding. We don't need a budget, because the activities is just for people traveling, and every national parliament is able to do that. Some members also fear that in terms of nomination, things might change. Because right now, since we are in form of people, those who are interested in national parliaments can join us. There's never much of a problem. If we become more institutionalized, if we become more a formal body, then of course nominations of candidates to join ISC might become much more political, not necessarily giving priority to those who are really motivated and interested in space, but also taking account political considerations, which actually could lead to the fact that some of our members might not be able to continue being a member and might be substituted by other people out of political reasons. So it is not a very simple discussion. I certainly think that strengthening ISC actually is one of our missions. For example, when it comes to the presidency, I personally think we should adapt that. I think we should have an incoming president, an acting president, and the president-elect, because then you would ensure that the president is involved for a period of 3 years and not only for 1 year. Particularly given that there are only 2 events a year, I think that is really something that I will propose. Our Estonian colleagues will take over from January 1st. We have to see. I think that evolving into parliamentary assembly is not for tomorrow. It would need a large consensus about members, which is not given currently, I must say, because the informal format is what we are used to. And if we have more obligations, we need more budget, we need more formalization, the nomination process will change and all of that. But nevertheless, I wanted to take that option up for discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for this outlook and for explaining this idea and the motivation behind the idea.
It's important, Thorsten, that you really say that this was our own initiative and there has been no consultation of ESA at this stage.
Absolutely. Let's look ahead to the future of the European space policy. So what developments do you think will shape the next few years? And also, what advice would you offer to Estonia as the successor presidency as it assumes the new term?
I start with the last one, which is the easiest. I think that Estonia, they already had the presidency in 2017. So now it's their second presidency. And I think they are really well positioned. The head of delegation of Estonia, Mario Kadacic, is a nuclear physicist who had been involved with CERN, close to Geneva, border with France. And he's extremely knowledgeable about the field. That's one thing. Then there's also Estonia and its position. They have enormous experience when it comes to Russian interference in their national affairs, in terms of cyber and in terms of all kinds of issues. I think that all of us in Europe can learn a lot from Estonia because they had to face this challenge for decades now. And I think they are quite advanced to this. So it comes as no surprise that the title of the Estonian presidency will be security and space, because that's really something where they are very knowledgeable about. Now, when it comes to the next years, I think, first of all, in terms of business, space is turning into a huge business of trillions, dollars, euros, whatever involved. There is a true race going on when it comes to satellites, particularly with low orbit, thousands of satellites being put out in a very short time frame. And none of the big countries wants to be a loser in this. And even Europe now has created this IRIS program because we need our own capacities. Right now we depend on SpaceX to put the satellites up into space, which is, of course, not quite independent. We are not as independent as we would need to be. Europe needs to develop its own technologies. That's one thing. Then there is an arms race. There's a geopolitical situation. The military aspect of space is becoming extremely important because all armies are going to use space satellite information. That cannot be neglected. So there will be security issues generally, and there will be cyber security issues. So what we need is really a collaboration, a cooperation of countries who share a set of common values. issues. And what we need in Europe is, of course, to strengthen our own organization. I think also but you know that as well, I suppose, right now, ESA is still the main actor in space. On the other hand, when it comes to the military, when it comes to defense, then of course the EU is playing a big part. But also when it comes to civil and commercial applications, I think that the EU Commission is willing also to take on space at a larger extent. And then respective roles between ESA and the European Commission might evolve in the coming years. So that's something to be seen. If you look at members, you have also small nations, take Luxembourg, that are members of ESA, but we always have found our place, which is a good thing. If now it is the European Commission, things might change because there you have the very large nations. And when it comes to public subscriptions, then of course you have large nations that are very advanced in terms of activities and technologies regarding space. And so I think that it will be a different balance within the EU Commission than what it is among ESA member states. I mean, Europe needs to react, there's no doubt about that. Things need to evolve. The situation around us evolves, and so we need to evolve as well. So this is not any kind of criticism. It's just about discussing, trying to answer your question in terms of what will we be looking at. I think also when you look at the US, their efforts will increase now with Elon Musk, who is already owner of SpaceX and who will oversee, as I have understood, industrial efforts and efficiency of American businesses and American industry. So I think it's very important for Europe to keep up with all of that, because already with the report by Mario Draghi, we are losing pace compared to China, compared to the US, and we need to face these challenges. And that cannot be done by continuing the way it has been over the last years and decades.
Absolutely. Dr. Gerald Schruckmel, thank you very much for this conversation. And I'm quite sure you just gave us an outlook. So what we can discuss the next time. So there are huge fields that we can explore together. Thank you very much for your time. All the best. And we hope to speak to you soon.
It was a pleasure, Thorsten. Thank you for inviting me.
And if you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.